Between late 1977 to early 1978, cousins Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono carried out a reign of terror in California, kidnapping, raping and killing 10 girls aged between 28 and 12 years old, strangling each victim in the hills above Los Angeles, which led to them being known as the Hillside Stranglers. Bianchi attempted to plead not guilty by way of insanity but was found to be faking mental illness, so instead agreed to plead guilty and testify against Buono. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Buono died of a heart attack in his cell in 2002. An American-born Scottish serial killer known to have killed 9 people across southern Scotland between 1956 and 1958, Manuel is suspected of having killed as many as 18 people. Police were unable to prove his guilt, as they contemplate until his final murders, when some banknotes Manuel had been using to pay for drinks in Glasgow pubs were proven to be stolen from one of his victims. He confessed to these murders after his mother confronted him at the police station where he was being held. Manuel was hanged at Glasgow's Barlinnie prison for his crimes in July 1958. He was one of the last prisoners to be hanged in Scotland before they ended capital punishment. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred West and his wife Rose tortured, raped and murdered at least 11 young women and girls, many at the couple's homes at 25 Cromwell Street, which was later Gloucester nicknamed the House of Horrors. The pair were apprehended and finally charged in 1994 after police obtained a search warrant and located several human bones buried within the garden and under the floorboards. Having been arrested and during his trial, Fred West hanged himself in his prison cell prior to being convicted. In 1995, Rose West was jailed for life, having been found guilty on 10 counts of murder. Their house at Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996 to discourage souvenir hunters. The British equivalent of Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Nilsen, was a homosexual killer who murdered 15 gay men within home in London, England between 1978 and 1983. He retained his victims' bodies before dissecting their remains and disposing of their bodies by burning or flushing the remains down the toilet, which led to his capture when human flesh was discovered in his sewage system. Nilsen was convicted in 1983 of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He remains imprisoned at Full Sutton Maximum Security Prison in Yorkshire, England, without the chance of release. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was an American serial killer and Satan worshipper who terrorized Los Angeles between 1984 and 1985. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, Ramirez broke into the homes of many of his victims, shooting, stabbing, raped and mutilating his victims, who ranged between a 9-year-old girl and a married couple aged in their late 60s. Notably, he smeared pentagrams on the walls of the crime scenes. Captured in 1985, Ramirez was sentenced to death and remained on California's death row for 23 years until he died in his cell in June 2013. One of the most widely known murderers of the 20th century, Ted Bundy was an American serial killer and rapist who kidnapped or overpowered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s. Bundy typically approached his female victims in a public place and led them to secluded areas where he would sexually assault and kill them. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept the severed heads in his apartment as trophies. Repeatedly captured twice, he managed to escape from police and courthouses before going on to commit 3 further killings. Convicted of multiple murders, he sentenced to death. He was executed by the electric chair in 1989. as known the Milwaukee Cannibal. Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped and murdered and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He also committed necrophilia and ate parts of his later victims, dismembering and cooking parts of their bodies within his home. Dahmer was eventually caught after a would-be victim managed to overpower him and alert police. In Dahmer 1992 was convicted of 15 of the murders and sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment. However, just 2 years into his sentence he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Brazilian, is a serial killer. Arrested in 1973, he was later convicted in 2003 of murdering at least 71 people and sentenced to 128 years imprisonment. Committing his first killing at the age of 14 and began a series of burglaries, carried out a murdering spree against local drug dealers, in revenge for his girlfriend being killed by criminals whilst he was in prison. By the age of 18 years old he had killed 10 people. Whilst imprisoned, he executed his own father, who was also serving time for murder. Remarkably, he went on to kill at least 47 inmates while imprisoned. Initially just sentenced to 30 years imprisonment, his continued killings have led to further convictions and his sentence has been increased to 400 years imprisonment. Camargo was a Colombian serial killer who is believed to have raped and killed over 150 young girls in Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 1980s. He calmly confessed to killing 71 girls in Ecuador after escaping from the Colombian prison. He led authorities to the dumping grounds of those victims whose bodies had not yet been recovered. After raping his victims, he had hacked the girls with a machete. He was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence available in Ecuador. In November 1994, he was murdered in prison by the cousin of one of his victims. Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman English was a doctor and is one of the world's most prolific serial killers in recorded history, proven to have been responsible for 250 of murders. A trusted doctor, he was well respected in his community. However, colleagues and local undertakers began raising concerns over the high death rate in the area and the large number of cremation forms for elderly women that he had countersigned. Several bodies were exhumed and later post-mortems revealed diamorphine within their system. It was later established Shipman had purposely injected fatal doses of the drug in a huge number of patients, causing their death. He then forged their wills so he could inherit large sums of money and completed cremation requests to destroy the victims' bodies. The trial judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences and recommended that he never be released. Shipman later hanged himself in January 2004 in his cell at Wakefield Prison.